all of you and our candidates for coming today. November 8th will be Election Day in California and throughout the nation, but we've already started voting, so today's event is very timely. Our two candidates are vying to represent District 52. It's one of 5 congressional districts in San Diego County. There are approximately 750,000 people who live in District 52. This district includes coastal and central portions of the city of San Diego, including neighborhoods such as Carmel Valley, La Jolla, Point Loma, and downtown San Diego, and the suburbs of Coronado and Poway. You previously saw the bios of each of the candidates, so we're not going to repeat those here. Congressman Scott Peters, the Democrat, has represented District 52 for 2 two-year terms, and he's vying for a 3rd two-year term. Ms. Denise Gitsham, the Republican, is challenging him for that office. Before I introduce the candidates today, I want to explain the format of this forum and the rules that will govern our time together. To begin, each candidate will be asked to give a 2-minute opening statement, and I'll call on them in alphabetical order. After their opening statements, I'll begin the questions. The candidate to whom each question is directed will have 1 minute for a response. If the other candidate wishes to speak to that same question, that person will also have a minute. All the questions that will be asked today were submitted by residents. They will be asked in the order of topics given highest priority by the residents who responded to the survey. We thank all the residents who participated. Rosemary Straley will be our timekeeper. She'll hold up a card with a large 15 on it to indicate there are 15 seconds remaining. When time's up, she'll ring a bell. And you won't be able to miss it. Candidates are requested to carefully observe the time so we can get as many questions as possible. At about 2 o'clock, closing statements by the candidates. So let us begin with the opening statements. Please welcome Ms. Denise Gitsham.
Would you rather me stand or would you rather me sit? Stand. Okay, great. Can you hear me? Oh, maybe I didn't speak into it enough. There we go.
It takes a few seconds.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for taking time out of your day. I know it's not always easy to get around or it's not always convenient, but in this case, it's mostly downstairs, right? So I'm grateful for you taking time out of this very, very important election season. There's so much noise right now at the top of the ticket that often races like ours that are down ticket, people don't really care quite as much about it. And I understand the emotion behind all of that, but I want you to know that as the daughter of immigrants, I'm so grateful for all of the blessings that we have to be in this country. I was born at Travis Air Force Base. My father was a 20-year U.S. Air Force veteran. He's fought in Vietnam. He's originally from Canada, so he's technically an immigrant. He counts. And my mother is originally from China. My grandfather was a 2-star general with Chiang Kai-shek. So in 1949, she moved to Taiwan, narrowly escaping communism, and moved to America, California specifically, in the 60s. And she came here because she knew that this was a land of golden opportunity. So I was blessed to be born here at Travis Air Force Base, born and raised. I went to college in Maine, and when I graduated, I worked for Governor George W. Bush in Austin, Texas on his campaign, also a historic election. And then I went to the White House, and I worked there before, during, and after 9/11. As you can imagine, that day had an enormous impact on every single person who lived through it. And certainly, as a 23-year-old staffer in the White House, I felt every significance of that moment and the importance of good leadership and good decision-making in the wake of it. So I resolved at that time that I would do whatever it took for the rest of my life to make sure that we protected America. That has been a theme throughout my career. Perfect, thank you. And since then, I worked at the U.S. Department of Justice. I went to Georgetown Law School. I worked in the U.S. Senate. I worked at a huge law firm. I came home to California, worked at a biotech renewable energy startup company, and then I started my own business 4 years ago. Thank you so much, and thanks for keeping the hook away.
Thank you, Ms. Gitsham. Next, please welcome Congressman Scott Peters.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'll tell you a little bit about me and what I'm working on in Congress, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion today. I was raised in a family dedicated to service. My dad is a minister who fought to desegregate housing in Detroit in the 1960s, when if you were Jewish or African American, you might not be able to buy a house. I practiced environmental law for 15 years. For part of that time, I had my own small business, a two-person law firm. And then I got frustrated with what was going on in the city. I know sometimes we share that frustration. I ran for city council, was elected, and worked on some of the big problems like reducing our sewer spills, which we had a lot of back then, and also completing big infrastructure projects like Highway 56, which for a long time was just two cul-de-sacs with no middle. I was fortunate that my colleagues unanimously elected me to be the first city council president in San Diego. And then after that I was termed out, I went to be a port commissioner. I was the chairman there, worked on expanding international trade and improving the downtown waterfront. So I have a long experience working in San Diego for you all. In Congress, I focused on San Diego. My focus, my service on San Diego. We are driven by tourism, by the uniformed military, and by science and technology. Places like Qualcomm, which is big in wireless, and Illumina, which is the center of genomics. So we work to improve basic science research, improve funding for that, immigration policy that lets us keep our talent here, student loan policy lets our kids get educated, a patent policy that protects our inventions. We're working for veterans to make sure they can get jobs. We're working to make sure they get health care. We haven't had the same problems here that we've had in Phoenix, but we have to change the culture there. We have to provide more resources. And on the Armed Services Committee, my portfolio is sustainability and energy. The military is leading the country and certainly federal government in switching to a sustainable energy platform. It's an honor to work on that, and I look forward to discussing all that today. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of words before we continue. If you could keep your microphones nice and close to your mouth so that everybody here can hear you well, that would be great. And we are going to project up onto the screen the question each time. So we're going to cut some of the lights, but not all the lights, because we want you to be able to see the candidates and them to see you. I'm going to continue in alphabetical order. So the first question, Ms. Gitsham, is for you. A recent poll shows that a majority of the American public believes Citizens United should be overturned. If you agree that campaign finance reform is needed, what actions are you prepared to take to make it happen?
You have a minute, right? Thank you so much for the question. You know, I'm just a small business owner. I don't really have any money of my own, and you all might know that Scott is fortunate to be the 10th wealthiest member of Congress. So if this affects anybody, it certainly affects me the most, because we only have a limit of $2,700 a person that we can raise in hard money, and Scott has a history of taking over half of his money from special interests. So I believe in leading by example. I believe that if we're going to talk about campaign finance reform and getting dark money out, then we need to start figuring out a way not to squelch free speech, because in fact, Citizens United allows not only corporations, but also labor unions to put in as much money as they want to. And so really, it's opening the doors to both sides. And I would love to limit how much money could be spent in this election. Certainly, Scott is outspending me by leaps and bounds simply because I don't have as much personal money to put into this race as he does. And I don't have as many special interests as he does that are interested in his race. They're not as interested in mine. So I think it's important that we take really clear steps to limit the total amount of money that we spend.
Thank you. As we go through all of the questions, Mr. Peters is right now getting up to respond. He'll have the same amount of time, and that will be the way we'll progress through all of these questions this afternoon.
I am for repealing Citizens United, unlike Ms. Gitsham. And you should know I haven't put any personal money in this campaign. I'm proud of having support from across the country, but mostly from San Diego. If she tells you she's not supported by special interests, that's just not correct. The fact is that since the decision in Citizens United, it's opened up a door to not just big money, but secret money. And the Republicans, who all used to be for disclosing the sources of that money, are no longer for it. They just think it's just fine. So I'm actually endorsed by a group called End Citizens United because of my work to stop that scourge and to get democracy back in your hands. Now, we can support disclosure without having Citizens United. I'm for that. We can also provide support for smaller donors so that when you make a donation, your donation is matched by federal dollars that will put you up on the same level, give you the same voice as some of those big companies. And I'm on an effort to reform the rules that way as well. So thank you.
All right, Mr. Peters, the second question is for you as regards gun safety. Clearly, misuse of guns is on the rise, and the easy availability of guns poses a major threat to citizens, to the police, and to our elected officials. What's your position on gun control, and would you work to ensure that assault-type weapons are banned?
What we've seen in our country recently with these shootings is just a tragedy. And the real tragedy is we can't get a vote on the House floor to do two simple things that 85% of Republicans, Democrats, and gun owners agree on, which is background checks, closing the background check loophole. If you go to Walmart and buy a gun, you have to go through a background check, but if you do it on the internet or at a gun show, you don't, except in California. And keeping the guns out of the hands of terrorists. We would like to see no fly, no buy. If you're not safe to go on a plane, you can't buy a gun. I've been going to the House floor every week and reading the names of victims of gun violence since Sandy Hook. I'll never catch up. I do that for a minute a week. And I was involved in a protest to try to get a vote because the leadership that supports Ms. Gitsham won't even let us vote on those two measures. Finally, I want to point out that Ms. Gitsham talked a little bit about special interest since she raised it. The company that owns Bushnell, that was used to shoot those first graders, employees of that company have given $50,000 to her campaign. So that's where she is on this issue.
You know, I believe that when you lead and you're a legislator, you're an elected official of all of us, great citizens in the 52nd, that if you have a disagreement with the folks across the aisle on how things should be done, then you should sit at a table and you should talk about how to solve hard problems. I don't think there's a lot of difference between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to making sure that we have background checks. I've gone on the record saying that. You can check the Union Tribune. Of course we need background checks. We also need to make sure that we spend a lot of money on mental health issues because we know guns don't shoot themselves. We also need to enforce the laws that currently exist. Rather than building a bigger net of laws, we need to make sure that we close the holes that are in our laws through enforcement. And so when Scott talks about how he staged a sit-in on the House floor, he broke every rule of decorum. And rather than being the elected leader of our district and representing a side of you that we could work through and figure out how to solve, he sat on the floor. And that's not how I think anyone should lead.
Ms. Gitsham, this one's for you, and it's about the broken Congress you've both been talking about a bit. Congress is widely viewed as dysfunctional. As our elected representative, what will you do to overcome the gridlock in Congress and to work cooperatively with both sides of the aisle? And also, as a part of the San Diego congressional delegation, what will you do to benefit our county?
You know, I want to read a quote from Scott's own website about fixing Congress. This is from 2012 when he was running against Brian Bilbray. He said, "Congress is broken. To change it, we need to change the people we send there, and we need to hold our representatives accountable." When he entered office, Congress was at 15% approval rating. Today, it hovers between 12 and 15% approval rating. So when you talk about, I agree with Scott. I'm sure you won't be surprised that I agree with Scott in that statement, because in fact, Scott has only passed one bill ever that he sponsored, and that was changing the name of the federal courthouse downtown. Now, we deserve much better representation for the great people of this district. There are many issues that we must address that affect our economic livelihood, our well-being, our future, our prosperity, and our national security. And so when we talk about someone who wants to work across aisles, again, I would challenge Scott to work across aisles rather than stage sit-ins or do something demonstrative that doesn't actually address or solve any problems. And I plan to do precisely that when I'm in Congress.
Okay, I'll take that challenge. When I went to Congress, one of the first things that the local Chamber of Commerce told us to work on was the border infrastructure, because border delays were so so toxic to our business environment. We had to fix that water infrastructure. And working together with the 5 of us, Republicans and Democrats, Darrell Isis, Scott Peters, Susan Davis, we got $500 million to fix that water infrastructure. The current delegation from San Diego County is a model for how to work together. We don't agree on a lot of the national issues, but locally we work together, and it is a good model, and it's been great progress. I've taken a bipartisan approach from when I was on the city council to now. I'm the 4th most independent Democrat there. When she says I've only passed 1 bill, that's just not true. I passed a number of bills as amendments to other bills. When I pass a bill requiring that the homelessness formula becomes changed so that we get more money, and as part of the transportation bill, they don't change the name of the transportation bill to my name, but it's still a bill we got passed. And I brought a record of success, and I hope you'll see that on the handouts we've given you.
Mr. Peters, the next one's for you. It's about energy and environment. The scientific community continues to warn of the consequences of global warming. Do you believe that global climate change is real? Will you support the actions necessary to implement the Paris Agreement? San Diego is a leader in solar generation. What will you do to ensure that solar and other renewable sources of energy are attractive for homeowners and businesses?
I do think it's a critical issue. It's a critical issue for the state and the federal government and the world, and it's overlooked. And I've made quite a point of working on that. My portfolio on the Armed Services Committee is renewable energy, where the Navy is going to 50% solar, 50% renewable, and the Marines are doing amazing battlefield solar and alternative energy. They're not powering their bunkers with generators anymore. They're using solar panels. They're using generators. They put solar panels on their backpacks to power small appliances. They weigh less than batteries. There's a revolution going on that I'm a big part of in the military. Unfortunately, because we can't get Republicans to talk about it, that's the only place it's happening. I'm the chair of the Democrats' Climate Task Force. We've got bills on reducing super pollutants that were generated out of research at UCSD. We've got bills on resiliency to prepare us for the effects of big weather. But it's folks in the Republican side of the aisle that won't talk about this issue. They see it as too toxic, and they're ignoring it.
You know, it's precisely that sort of tone that I think we're all tired of in Washington, where we just point our fingers across the aisle and say it's their fault. It's our job as elected leaders to make sure that we reach out and figure out how to move forward in the areas that we do agree on. When I was in Washington, D.C., I actually worked there in a law firm, and then I went in-house to come home to San Diego to work for a renewable energy company. So I wanted to use technology that we created here at Scripps and spun out into an algae-based fuel company. Scott now chairs the algae caucus that I actually started in 2008, ironically, because San Diego is a leader in innovation, specifically when it comes to algae-based biofuels. So I'm very proud of being a Republican who addressed the challenges of climate change and the future energy security of our nation and our military by putting my skills to figuring out a solution. That's what we need in this Congress. We need someone who figures out how to leverage the private sector, not punish it, to figure out how we address the most difficult problems that we're facing today. Thank you.
Ms. Gitsham, the next question's for you about income disparity and poverty. The gap between rich and poor in this country is enormous, especially compared with other countries, and this divide just keeps growing. The middle class, which has played an important role in making America great, is in serious decline. What actions can Congress take to address this very serious problem of income disparity? And specifically, what will you do?
You know, there's a saying called tax into poverty that is very real for many people in the middle class. I'm a middle class person, so I understand when you try to have businesses, small businesses in particular, to hire people, you want to incentivize the economy's biggest drivers. 95% of new jobs are created by small businesses. Scott votes against small businesses, which enable people to get hired to come out of poverty 70% of the time, according to NFIB, which is the leading voice for small business in the nation. If we do not have a thriving employment sector that enables people to earn their way out of poverty, and we don't have tax structures that enable them to actually get credit, things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a bipartisan thing that both President Obama and Speaker Ryan have agreed should be something that incentivizes people to work by lowering their taxes as they do. If we're not all moving in that direction, and we think the answer is to give more of our hard-earned money in taxes to Washington to waste, then we're going down the wrong path and people will be stuck in poverty forever.
Let me answer the question. First of all, I wouldn't be endorsed by the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce or the United States Chamber of Commerce. My record on small business is that bad. 90% of the members of the Regional Chamber of Commerce are small businesses. They think I've been good for business. But from a congressional perspective, one thing we need to do is we really need to invest in infrastructure and in science. We've brought returns in both of those. We've increased the investment in the National Institutes of Health, which funds all those jobs on the Mesa, doing research, by about $3 billion. That's some progress. We also need to build infrastructure. As I mentioned, we're putting $500 million into the border crossing. We're putting $1 billion into the trolley here, which will help get people from this area, UCSD, down to downtown. We're putting money into the new Sears facility in Coronado, new infrastructure in Miramar, where we got a grant for the port to help international trade. Those are all things that I brought to San Diego as part of, even in a dysfunctional Congress, by working across the aisle as we all know we should.
Mr. Peters, the next question's for you on education and the cost of college. Loans to cover the cost of attending college have a major limiting effect on the subsequent lives of graduates and on the economy when they aren't able, for example, to buy homes. What will you do to help reduce the crushing debt burden that is strangling many current and former students? And what will you do to make college more affordable?
Well, as I said, this is a personal issue for me. My dad's a minister. We didn't have any money growing up. But he told me in the 1970s, get into the best school that you get into, and we'll figure out a way to pay for it. I was able to gain admission to Duke University. I went to school. We had grants, low-interest loans, a work-study job. I got through there without really too much debt left over. And today the situation's changed. The average cost of a public university education since I left school has gone up by 300% adjusted for inflation. And interest rates are too high in student loans. So we've done two things. One is we fought the Republicans trying to increase that interest rate to keep it low so that kids can afford it. The average debt, by the way, $33,000 for an undergraduate. We've also come up with a plan we'd like to push in the next Congress that would allow employers to match employees' student loan repayments. Employee pays $6,000, the employer would match it with $6,000, and then that would not be taxable to the employee, which would benefit both sides.
We have a lot in common there, Scott and I. I worked my way. My dad was a school teacher for the state of California, teaching vocational education, because he knew that not everybody wants to go to college or is suited to go to college. And there are many paths that are very honorable that had nothing to do with going to a four-year college. And so my dad devoted his life to that. My mom was a homemaker. So of course I had to work throughout undergrad. I also worked full-time while I went to law school full-time at Georgetown. And so I understand I still have $100,000 in law school debt because I couldn't pay it off. It was $50,000 a year. But I did exactly what Scott's parents said to him, which was I went to the best school I could get into, and I committed myself to working in jobs that I needed to pay it off. Now there are many innovative ways. Risk sharing in the loan structure is something we see all throughout the economy. But for some reason, we don't use that when it comes to school loans. And so instead of giving an incentive, offering an incentive through policies to ensure that we can actually bring down the cost of college, government is initiating federal loans that drive costs up. So we need to figure out free market ways to bring that down.
Ms. Gitsham, the next question's for you again. Supreme Court. Although it's the Senate that acts on nominations to the Supreme Court, because of the crucial role the Supreme Court plays and the likelihood that there are going to be a number of vacancies in the next 4 years, we'd like to hear your thoughts about what criteria the president should consider in nominating justices to the High Court.
I'm so glad that that's a question I actually have some experience with. I worked in the U.S. Senate, in the Senate Judiciary Committee, on the confirmation of Chief Justice John Roberts. And so I actually worked there while I was in my second year of law school full-time. So I saw the rigorous vetting process through which every single qualified person who comes before the Senate must undergo. And it's vigorous, believe me, it's very rigorous. And so I think that the thing that we really need to think about is, what are your values that you really ascribe to as you think about the Supreme Court? There are values that we all hold dear, and each of you has your own, the ones that you were raised with. I believe that the Constitution is one of the best pieces that are created by man in governance that has ever been created. And I believe that we need to find Supreme Court justices that understand the limitations of the federal government and interpret the Constitution accordingly. Because when we have activist judges, it's never good on either side. You might like it when it goes with you, but not when it goes against you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's a glaring problem right now. We're not even getting a vote on President Obama's nomination. He was a very reasonable guy and a pretty moderate person, not seen as a partisan. And I called for a vote. I think everyone should support having a vote in the Senate on that nomination. I'm not sure values is the most important thing. I would just say that when I hear that from Ms. Gitsham, I'm a little concerned because she's not a supporter of women's right to choose or LGBT equality. And I think I'm more concerned about someone who will follow the law. When we were raised, when I went to law school, I think probably when Denise went too, the Supreme Court was seen as a nonpartisan thing. It's become way too political. We want them to set a fair playing field. We want everyone to abide by the law, but ever since Bush versus Gore, it's been mistrusted. We need to get that institution back above politics, and that's what I hope we will do.
All right, the next question, Mr. Powers, is healthcare. The World Health Organization said in a 2014 report that the United States is currently the only high-income country without nearly universal health care coverage. Under the Affordable Care Act, millions of previously uninsured Americans now have health care insurance coverage. What specific steps will you take to make quality health care more affordable and available to all Americans?
I took office in 2013, which was just after the Affordable Care Act had passed in 2009. And when I ran for office back then, I said, look, it didn't come from Moses. It's a big undertaking. It's a lot of improvement in it, you know, pre-existing conditions, stay on your parents until you're 26. But we have a lot of work to do. So I voted quite often to make fixes to it. Let you keep your doctor if you like him or her. 30-hour, 40-hour work week instead of a 30-hour work week. Things that made my party upset because they thought Democrats shouldn't be voting on it. We've done a lot to increase access. We've got a lot of more work to do on affordability. And I should have a record of voting with Republicans when it's appropriate to make sure that we address those issues, and I'll continue to do that.
You know, I find it interesting that it's called the Affordable Care Act because if any of you know what's happened in the last year and just the last week, the letters that went out to those who are under Obamacare had a 32% spike in their premiums. That's unacceptable. It's anything but affordable. And I think that one thing we need to really be honest about is that we're getting a lot less for a lot and requiring a lot more money to get it. And that's what Obamacare has turned into. Now, I think that we need to preserve the parts of Obamacare, the spirit that required that you get coverage regardless of your pre-existing conditions. That's humane. We should do that as an industrialized, as a rich nation. We must take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. It's unacceptable that anyone would not be able to have health care that covers their basic needs. But we need to figure out where we can use the free market. Again, we are incredibly innovative people, where we can lower barriers to free market access for the cheapest plans that give us the most. Imagine that. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution to healthcare. We need to be able to choose what works best for us.
Ms. Gitsham, the next question's on immigration, a topic I'm sure close to your heart and to the heart of many people in this room. The United States has always been a country of immigrants. The Republican candidate for president has taken strong positions on immigration, particularly of Mexicans and Muslims. What do you think needs to be done to address our country's current immigration challenges?
Well, you know, I disagree strongly with the tone that the Republican nominee has taken in talking about most people. The tone is unacceptable because my parents and all of our parents, or ourselves, we were all immigrants at one time. And so being the firstborn in my family in America, this is especially unique, you know, a feeling it really brings up in me that makes me angry when I hear those words spoken about people who want to come to such a blessed country. My grandfather came here when he was 80, so he could die an American citizen. It took him 10 years to come through legally. He learned English because he believed that being an American was a privilege, not a right. I think that's something that we can all appreciate for all the blood that's been shed to ensure that we have the liberties that we have. And so we need to honor the people who come over legally by making sure that they have a priority when it comes to earning citizenship. Otherwise, what's the point of having any laws at all? If we want to scrap them all and start from scratch, let's have an honest debate. But things like sanctuary cities, which reward cities for breaking federal law, are not harmonized in our law and make no sense. So we need to get rid of inconsistencies in them and make sure we protect our nation by keeping out criminals who come over the border or anywhere.
Well, we're all immigrants. We understand the importance of immigration over the history of our country. In 2013, the Senate passed a bill with bipartisan support, 69 votes. It would have increased border security, allowed more tech workers to stay here because we really need that brain power to be in the United States. Farm workers. It would have allowed all those people living in the shadows today, working at home, healthcare, everywhere else, 11 million people, to be working legally and paying taxes, which is what we want. We could not get a vote on the House floor. Mr. Boehner and Mr. Ryan won't allow that vote to take place. And we're ready to compromise. We're ready to work on it. And I think it's very important. The United States Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO agree. The tech community, the faith community, and farm workers and farmers all agree we have to fix this broken immigration system. And you can't go around talking about enforcing a set of laws that is all that bad. We really can't deport 11 million people. That's what enforcing this law is about. It needs to be fixed now, and I'm ready to work on that.
All right, Mr. Peters, Foreign Affairs. Your opponent has been running TV ads alleging that you voted to give $1.4 billion to Iran and that it will be used for atomic warheads and terrorism. Please explain your position on the Iran nuclear agreement and comment about your opponent's allegations.
Well, this is what people don't like about politics. I mean, I supported the Iran nuclear agreement because it was the only way to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. My opponent wants another war in the Middle East, you can say so. We have other options now, okay? So now, most of the fissile uranium has been moved out of the country. Centrifuges, most of them have been dismantled. The plutonium reactor has been dismantled. We've got inspectors all over looking for violations in the toughest inspections regime of any deal like this of its kind. We still have not given up any military options, so if we have to attack Iran, we can still do that. But we'll now have, because the inspectors will have a lot better chance of success. The only alternative we had before the Iran deal was war, and now we have a better alternative. Iran is not our friend. They're still doing counter-terror, they're still funding terrorism, they're still doing ballistic missiles, but an Iran without nuclear weapons is a safer adversary than an Iran with nuclear weapons. That's why I'm proud to support the deal.
You know, we saw this before, this Iran nuclear agreement, except for it was in 1994 when President Clinton fostered a similar agreement with North Korea. And now today, North Korea is one of the only rogue countries that has 6 to 12 nuclear warheads and ICBMs capable of taking them as far as Italy. And so we know what happens when you kick the can down the road, you give $150 billion, much more than $1.4 billion, $150 billion to the leading state sponsor of terror. Now I ask you, we are fighting a war against ISIS, whether we want to accept it or not. War has come and found us. So you tell me, if you think it makes sense to tell those men and women who go and are defending our liberty every single day that we're going to fund both sides of the war. We're going to ask them to go and risk their lives to make sure that we keep terrorism down. When Iran, the lead state sponsor of terror, we are giving $150 billion to fund ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas. This is an issue of judgment. He has poor judgment on this issue.
All right, Ms. Gitsham, do you support the Simpson-Bowles plan to reduce the federal deficit by cutting spending and raising taxes? If you don't support it, what's your plan to bring down the budget deficit and to lower the national debt?
I will never, ever support asking you to give more of the hard-earned dollars that you have worked so long for into an inefficient, ineffective, and wasteful government. Now, we have government agencies that grow for the sake of continuing to exist and no ability to shrink it. And I will never, ever ask you to give more than your share to make sure that we have an accountable Washington that actually is able to limit where it's ineffective and focus on the things it needs to do well. And I don't think we need to do that by raising taxes. And so I really believe that unless we figure out how we ask Congress to do zero-based budgeting, to justify it, just like we do every single day in our own budgets, justify everything that we spend, prioritize and make that transparent. What are your top 10, top 5 priorities? And then we can talk about all the rest. Until we're willing to make hard decisions on budgeting ourselves by justifying every expense, we should never ask you for another penny of your tax dollars.
That's a little bit like that. Remember the Tea Party pledge that no one's tax bill will ever go up by a penny ever? That's a little bit what you just heard. I don't think it's realistic. I think the Simpson-Bowles approach is a reasonable approach. I didn't love everything in it, but we need some grand bargain between the president, maybe President Clinton and Speaker Ryan, that deals with long-term debt. Because if we don't deal with it, we're really borrowing money from my generation, or from my kids' generation, from me. And none of us wants to do that. I would say that I've actually presented the only alternative I know of to deal with the debt ceiling phenomenon. The debt ceiling, we raise it every year. It's like the credit card bill you get, right? You get a credit card bill. That's not when you say, I'm going to cut spending. You've already spent that money. So my bill would say, when the debt is going up as a percentage of the economy, we would provide mechanisms to force a discussion on the House floor about what to do about this long-term debt, which we are kicking down the road, where no one's doing anything with it. That's why I'm affiliated with Fix the Debt, and I'm called a fiscal hero by them.
The next question's for you, Mr. Peters, and it's about infrastructure. The infrastructure needs of our country, our state, our city, and even our district are many. What steps would you take to begin to address those needs?
Well, I already have. I think I've ticked off a few. We've got $500 million at the border to fix the infrastructure, the trade infrastructure that supports our local economy and small businesses on both sides of the border. We're bringing $1 billion to build a trolley that will go from downtown up to UTC and UCSD that will help a lot with congestion. We're going to rebuild the SEALs. The Navy SEALs need a new campus. I'm the co-chair of the Special Ops Caucus, Special Operations. The SEALs are the only ones who haven't had a redo. You're going to be so proud of the $750 million we're going to spend, not just because of what the SEALs do, but because it's going to be a beautiful structure you can be proud of. We're putting new infrastructure in at Miramar for new fighter jets. And when I was a port commissioner, I tried really hard to get a $10 million grant from the federal government to help redo the marine terminals to help support trade. I couldn't get that until I was a Congress member. I could call the Department of Transportation. We have that grant in hand today. We're working on that.
There is a measure, of course, you've probably seen it. There's so many on this ballot called Measure A, which proposes a 0.5 cent tax increase for sales tax. And it's for 40 years, and I believe that you supported, I'm not sure. I think you came out. But in fact, only 18% it's been found of the monies that are raised over the next 40 years would actually go towards addressing the issues of infrastructure. So we have to be careful on in this election cycle to read the fine print. I also believe that given that Measure A doesn't really only address infrastructure, we should really think about, and also given the fact that it's very, very increasingly expensive to live in San Diego. If you haven't seen, most recently a news article came out saying that San Diego is one of the least affordable places to live. I don't think you should come at the expense of taxpayers who can least afford to shoulder a 0.5 cent tax charge for the next 40 years. We need to be smarter about how we use the resources that we have. Again, government needs to be more responsible with what we give it.
All right. Our next question, Ms. Gitsham, is for you, and it's about San Diego priorities. Homelessness and lack of affordable housing are just two of the big problems facing San Diego. What are your ideas for addressing these challenges, and what actions could Congress take to assist?
I've been working with Urban Angels for a long time. A friend of mine in the private sector made a for-profit organization because he couldn't wait long enough to solve the problem by waiting for a 501c3 status. So he built a kitchen in the basement of the Connections Path housing downtown. And he is teaching temporary residents who live in this transitional housing for people who experience homelessness real skills so that they can transition into a job that enables them to have confidence and earn their way out of homelessness. In the city of Albuquerque, we're watching a Republican mayor hire homeless people to clean the streets. In return, they get a wage. They also get a night's stay and a shower and meals. Those are smart ways to address homelessness rather than throwing more federal dollars at a problem and hoping that it goes away, in addition to making sure that our city has the funds that we need to address homelessness through HUD. We must also equip people to help themselves.
It's still good to have federal dollars.
Always good.
When I was, in 2013, what I learned a startling statistic was that we are about 3rd to 5th in homelessness population in San Diego, but about 18th to 23rd in funding. So the formula is a mess. It's outdated. We needed it updated. I wrote then to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. I worked with the new Secretary of Urban Development, Secretary Castro, brought him out here to San Diego to see the situation. And a lot of our population is veterans because of the nature of our population. And he said to me he agreed to consider changing the formula. We passed a bill in Congress requiring the president to open up the formula for changes. They sent us a draft of 4 different alternatives. Any one of the 4 alternatives that we're going to get will bring millions of dollars more to San Diego to deal with homelessness. It's mostly a state and local issue. We've got great leaders here from Todd Gloria, Tony Atkins, and Kevin Faulkner, but they need the federal resources that we deserve. We need our fair share, and I'm going to get them for you.
Our next question about tax reform. There's lots of talk during this election season about need for tax reform. What principles will guide you as Congress tackles this issue, assuming it will?
Well, we're in really in kind of a crisis situation, and I actually agree a lot with Republicans on some of these issues. One is that our corporate tax rate makes us uncompetitive nationally. 35% is too high. We've also got a lot of money stranded overseas because we tax it at 35% if it comes back, so companies just park it over there and they don't bring it back where it could be invested. And that needs to be fixed. And we also need to make sure that our tax system is generating enough money to fund our needs, from military to infrastructure to homelessness funding, everything else, and that it's equitable. And we certainly don't want more of the George Bush-style tax cuts for the most wealthy people. I also think I agree, I think that middle-income people are already paying a large share of their income. We don't want to have more tax cuts for the wealthy, more tax cuts for big corporations. I think that's the line that my opponent has been on. I disagree with that.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that line because tax law is so interesting. The principles that you operate from, you either believe that Washington should take more of your money because they know better how to live their lives and run their businesses and their schools than you do, or you believe that Washington is actually rather wasteful and needs to get smarter about using the money that we give them. So, I tend to resist wanting to give more of your money to solve problems that Washington should be smarter about. And one example that I would point out that as a small business owner is particularly egregious to me, especially since my parents were also small business owners, is Scott voted against the Republican efforts to repeal the death tax. Now, that's not the greediest overreaching. It's the biggest barrier to intergenerational transfer of wealth. To believe that after you pass on, you can only give half of what you worked your whole life to build because the government wants to take one more swipe at it. That is something I fundamentally disagree on, and it goes back to that principle that I spoke of first.
Our next question, Ms. Gitsham, is about women's rights. Your opponent has been a strong advocate for women's rights in Congress. How will you vote on equal pay for equal work and on defending women's health care and reproductive rights?
As a woman, I'm for women. I went to Wellesley College for a semester. I learned all about Hillary Clinton's alma mater. And of course, I am pro-women, but I'm also pro-child. I don't think that there is this division that we create that says you're a bad person if you fall on either side of this. And in my faith, which is a very important part of my life, and I'm very proud of, teaches me that every single life has intrinsic God-given value. Now, that is not something that you see played out once children are born. And I think that our Congress, our government, if it requires that women should be allowed to not have that opportunity to make those choices, we need to support women in their decisions to have children. This decision was actually made in 1973, Roe v. Wade, and nothing has ever changed it. I don't foresee that it will. I'm not a crusader to roll back Roe v. Wade, but I want to limit every taxpayer's dollars that might go towards funding something we morally disagree with. I think that's just fair.
I totally respect Denise's religious views, and I certainly think we should not do anything to get in the way of her choice about what to do with her family and her future. But the point is, we don't want the government to make that decision for anyone. That's a decision that should be left to women and their families, not to the government. That's why I'm a strong supporter of a woman's right to choose, make those healthcare choices. And I'm endorsed by Planned Parenthood. I think I have been in every single election I've run in. Because that's your choice. That is not the government's choice. I think also the thing you ought to know is that the government already prohibits any federal money under the Hyde Amendment from being used for abortion. So when you talk about things like defunding Planned Parenthood, you're talking about breast cancer screenings and cervical cancer screenings and preventative health care. You're talking about taking health care away from women that has nothing to do with the moral choices that she's referenced. So that's why I'm really proud to stand on that side and have the endorsement of Planned Parenthood. And I'll always stand up for women and fight for you too.
Our next question, Mr. Peters, is about Social Security. It's an important national commitment to maintaining income security for seniors. Do you support privatization of Social Security? And if so, how would you go about it?
I don't support privatization of Medicare or Social Security, voucherization of Medicare. Look, Social Security and Medicare are social insurance programs that people have paid into. I'm seeing a lot of people here. You may be older than me, a couple of you. You've paid into over a lifetime of work, and that's a bargain that we've made with you, so we have to stand behind it. We're going to have to take some steps to make it solvent, because after some of you are gone, the trends are not right for Social Security. We're going to have to do some things to strengthen it. But I'm willing to take on that fight because it's an important thing. We need to stand behind it. We need to stand behind the Medicare guarantee.
Social Security must remain as it is for everyone who depends on it now, period. We must keep our promises to everyone who depends on that. It's not something that we can play with. So every idea that I have is for protecting and preserving Social Security for my generation. Social Security on its current path is scheduled to be insolvent by 2035. In 2035, I'll be 58. So guess who it falls on? My generation. So I'm very interested in how we make sure that we're responsible about it. And I'm very, very clear that I think that there's been a life expectancy change that has happened since Social Security was instated. We live about 10 years longer. I think that at some point we need to talk about how my generation figures out how to delay the onset of our benefits so that we can have them for the future. I also think that there's probably some sort of mean testing that needs to happen so that those who don't need it would probably be very happy to give it back to preserve it for those that do.
Our next question, Ms. Gitsham, is for you about job creation. Globalization and advances in technology are requiring a highly skilled workforce. What steps do you propose Congress take to keep pace with future needs and to maintain U.S. competitiveness?
You know, I have a public relations firm, that's what my small business is, and I work with so many tech companies all the time that say they are looking for a skilled workforce that has specific skills that H-1B visas allow to bring into our workforce, things that we need in order to keep innovation going. And as somebody who's half Chinese, obviously I have a lot of family that's in China and Taiwan, a lot of those folks are very skilled. STEM is something that's very strong in my culture, in the Asian culture. And it's something that we need to promote. But in the meantime, here in America, we need to make sure that we do not have barriers to the companies that are innovating to getting the skilled labor that they need in order to thrive and hire more people, both here and abroad.
At the risk of repeating myself, I think government should be investing in things like science research and infrastructure because there's appropriate roles for government. Those things will bring jobs right away. I should mention, I'm on the Judiciary Committee subcommittee on regulatory reform because I do believe that government can do a better job of getting high standards with less disruption to the economy. I don't think that's beyond us. And I've been the one person on the Judiciary Committee, the Democrat, who's willing to vote with Republicans to provide shorter permit timeframes and to streamline environmental review, because I think we can get high standards with less process. So there's a lot we could do. I think I mentioned a lot of those already, but I wanted to point out that there is regulatory relief that's important. Democrats can be proud about participating in it, and I certainly am. Thank you.
Mr. Peters, the next question is about economic development. What do you see as the major challenge to improving San Diego's economy, California's economy, and the nation's economy?
San Diego needs a 21st century transportation system. We're kind of hamstrung because we grew up with the automobile, so there's a lot of sprawl. It's really difficult to overlay transit on top of that. So we're fighting back against that. But we need to be very smart about land use, how we orient new development around transit. We need more walkable communities, we need more biking. We just need a whole plan that thinks about that. For San Diego's economy, I think that's one of the most important things. The other thing for California and San Diego is the cost of housing. Governor Brown has tried to do some things to make housing easier to build in California. We want the right kind of housing, not taxing the freeways. We want infill. It's been very difficult because there's a lot of process, a lot of opportunities for the public to delay it. I've been actually active to try to force the state to do the right thing on that. And at the federal level, we just have a lack of demand. We need to get the economy moving. Like I said, a lot of that is about infrastructure, agreeing on a budget deal, agreeing on immigration for some of our workforce challenges, and getting our budget right.
So I grew up, as I told you, in California, and the California that I left in 1995 when I went to college is very different from the one that I came back to in 2008. Largely it was because so many companies had decided that it was very difficult to start a company and keep it in San Diego, in California at large. We've lost over 7,000 companies in a mass exodus to states that are far inferior to ours. Nobody wants to go to Texas or Nevada or have to leave our beautiful state. And we shouldn't have to in order to thrive. But what you're seeing in Sacramento and Washington as well is a mentality that the government should take more taxes and instead of allowing business owners to reinvest their money back in a workforce and reinvest in their own growth of their businesses. So we have to lower taxes. We also need to figure out how to reduce regulatory stranglehold. And my company, the renewable energy company, struggled. We had to move to New Mexico because we couldn't get through California's regulatory regime to build a company out here beyond the startup phase and hire people here to invest in San Diego, and that's a shame.
In the interest of time, I'm going to combine the next two questions. The first one is about what you think are the three biggest problems, and the next one is, what are your three top priorities? So if you could work those together, that would be great. Top three problems, top three priorities.
Sure. So overall, I think that one of the feelings that I get when I talk to everyone in the district is there's a sense of uncertainty and unease in America right now. We're not really sure where we're going with respect to national security, which is a top issue. We've seen terrorism come to our country, which we need to get stronger about making sure it doesn't. We need to be clear on who we are as a nation, that we are the greatest force for good, stability, and peace as Americans. We project great values. We need to make sure we get our national security, our foreign policy, and our homeland security tightened up, because that is our #1 job as a Congress, is to protect Americans. Second thing is, of course, we have to get our economy on right so that we can have people have prosperity, to have jobs, and that goes back to the question that I just answered. The third one is education. My dad, like I told you, taught for the state of California. My mother was a school teacher in Taiwan before she came here to America. And so education is the great equalizer. It's the one area in which we can ensure that our children and our grandchildren have a truly prosperous future.
I would say our first and most important job is your safety and security. So we've got a really challenging military issue ahead of us. It's not just the United States versus the Soviet Union. We've got Russia, we've got China, we've got Iran, North Korea, ISIS, and we're not just fighting air, land, and sea. We're fighting underwater, we're fighting cyber, we're fighting in space. That's a real challenge. Second is our economic security. We have to be competitive. People don't think of themselves as victims, but they want the tools, the education to compete. We want to lead in science, we want to lead in education, and we want to make sure that our workers who are displaced are retrained so that they can continue to compete in the economy. And the third thing for me is making Congress work. We have a Congress that doesn't have an ethic of getting things done. And we're still working on that. I have a bill, no budget, no pay. You don't pass a budget on time, you don't get paid. You have to work a 5-day work week like the rest of Americans, right? You have to abide by the same rules as everybody else does. And we get that attitude in Congress, which is very well removed and very insulated. We'll do a lot better on every other issue.
Ms. Gitsham, the last question's for you. There's no question that this presidential election season has been, very unusual. The question, do you support your party's nominee?
Did Scott write this one? This is my favorite question. No, it's really not. I worked for a president who believed that we were better when we were united rather than divided, President George W. Bush. And he started off his career at the White House by working across aisles to pass legislation very, very early on. I have a very different perspective on how our party has gone. And one of the things I think does a discredit to you is talking about two personalities, one of which will be irrelevant, will become a footnote in history after November 8th, I pray. And what we need to focus on, what I think we should be talking about, are the policy issues that you've so kindly brought to our attention today. Because those are the issues that are really going to matter after November 8th. So we've got 20 more days where we have to talk about these two people. But what matters is that we focus on the policies that are going to affect our lives after November 8th.
I didn't hear it either. I will tell you, I support my party's nominee. She's not a perfect candidate. She's made mistakes, but she's got a great resume. She's got, I think, the temperament to be president, and she'll certainly have my support working with her in Congress. If you're kind enough to send me back, I would like to be her partner. And I think, as much as we are concerned about our own election, the election to the 52nd district in Congress is not the most important election right now. It's the presidential election. And you learn a lot about people by what they say about the presidential candidates. You got to go to Congress often and take votes. You don't like the yes or the no, but you got to pick one. And Ms. Gitsham won't tell us today which of the candidates for president she'll pick. Okay, so I think that is a really significant thing. It says a lot about her values. It doesn't tell you where she is. It doesn't tell you whether she's going to stand up to Mr. Trump, because she's certainly not doing it now. And a lot of Republicans are, and that's what we need.
Thank you. That concludes the question and answer portion of our afternoon program, but we're ready for closing statements. So since Ms. Gitsham went first on the opening statements, Mr. Peters, it's your turn.
Thank you all. Thanks so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be back with you today. I think this is my third visit here. You did buy me lunch once, so I don't know what that was. Look, this job's a lot about accomplishments. I talked about the homelessness formula. I talked a lot about our infrastructure successes, and a lot of what we're getting done in a dysfunctional Congress. Look, I think a bipartisan approach is the best way to solve these problems in this Congress. I've been rated the 4th most independent Democrat because I'm willing to vote with Republicans when it's the right thing to do. And I'm a civil rights Democrat. So on Planned Parenthood, I'm endorsed by Planned Parenthood, League of Conservation Voters, and Citizens United. I'm for sensible gun regulation. On those things, we're just going to have a disagreement. But on economic issues, we can come to the middle of the table, and we can come to the middle of the room, and we can make a deal on tax policy that will incentivize domestic job creation, on good immigration policy. That's the reputation I developed throughout my service here. That's why I'm endorsed by not just the Democratic groups or the liberal groups, by the Chamber of Commerce. The United States Chamber of Commerce endorsed 5 Democrats last time. I was one of them. They've endorsed me again. The Regional Chamber of Commerce, and the first candidate for Congress of either party to be endorsed by the Regional Chamber, 90% small businesses because of what I've done for business. Biocom, 3 times Biocom Legislator of the Year, the San Diego Downtown Partnership. Those people wouldn't all endorse me if they didn't think that I was doing a good job reaching across the aisle, if they didn't think I was bringing the right approach to fixing Congress. It's not fixed yet. I told my wife I needed another 2 years. But I'm working on it, and if you're kind enough and you honor me again with sending me back for a 3rd term, I'll continue to work in that way and fight for San Diego, fight for our country, and fight for a successful Washington, D.C., which we would all like to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Gitsham?
I heard a lot from Scott that really encourages me, that we're ready to go to work. We're ready to work across the aisles And I look and I think maybe that's the voice of somebody who's just jumping into this race like me for the first time. Because when you've been there for 4 years and you've never done anything significant for our district, then it makes me wonder how you're going to be able to fix it later on. And so you don't have to take my word for it. Scott votes 85% of the time with Nancy Pelosi. So when we talk about a district and working across aisle, it's very important that we make sure that our rhetoric matches the votes. And I would challenge you to look at the facts as opposed to just listening to the words. And so my focus is on making sure that you think in terms of what matters the most to you as to what you get out of Washington. At the end of the day, this race comes down to a very simple disagreement between Scott and I. Either you trust Washington, D.C., 3,000 miles away, to make decisions for you with your life and your resources and your time and your talent in your schools, in your businesses, in your churches, in your communities. Or you believe, like I do, that we need to return control to we the people. And at the end of the day, every single time, I'm going to trust you. Thank you.
Well, let's give another big V thank you to our guests today. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and their cookies and coffee